This episode is part of a long series exploring how some evangelicals turned to the Republican Party in the 1970s and 80s. This show is about the Christian church, but we're not going to go super deep into that today, because the reasons that Carter lost the 1980 election go beyond the religious right, and they are fascinating. We're going to cover the beefs that the religious right held against Carter in the next episode, because I really think this is important. This is The Many Plagues of Jimmy Carter. In 1968, a young man named Pat Goodell had an idea for a math project. It was an election year, so he's a high school senior and he goes out and knocks on doors.
Excuse me, who are you voting for this year?
That year, citizens could pick between Richard Nixon, Robert Kennedy Sr., or George Wallace. Three candidates with vastly different ideologies. He went to one home and heard,
I'm voting for either Robert Kennedy or George Wallace.
He thought that was odd. Those two candidates were really different from each other. But that's just one person, right? What would the neighbors think?
I like Wallace and Kennedy. You can believe them.
Two in a row. This is an interesting neighborhood. Excuse me, who are you voting for?
That Kennedy boy or George Wallace. They're tough guys.
Over and over, it was a similar answer. I want Wallace or Kennedy, which doesn't seem to make any sense. George Wallace was the arch-segregationist governor of Alabama who said, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Crisscrossing the country in favor of, segregation and quote-unquote states' rights. Then there was Kennedy, whose brother had proposed the Civil Rights Act. Wallace and Kennedy were enemies. Fundamentally different candidates. So why did people keep saying they'd vote for either of them? The same happened 4 years later when Shirley Chisholm ran. She was the first woman to seek the Democratic nomination and the first black person to reach for the presidential nomination of either party. People would literally say,
I want either Chisholm or Wallace.
Which is lunacy. Why were the American people willing to vote for either an arch-segregationist or a black woman? Goodell went on to study this, and then to start a company advising politicians. It turns out that the dominant feeling for American voters was alienation. These candidates spoke to the crisis of confidence that everyday people felt in the country, a sense that Washington was leaving them behind. They wanted someone who was an outsider, someone who was tough. George Wallace ran on the slogan,
Send them a message.
When Jimmy Carter ran and won in 1976, his pitch to the country took it a step further.
This time, don't send them a message, send them a president.
Carter was a fascinating mix of things. An evangelical, perhaps the first evangelical president, and a guy who upset evangelicals with large followings. A moderate, a Democrat, made his money in agriculture and then went to Washington. A humble man who hung out with rock stars. He served just one term before being defeated by Ronald Reagan. The late 1970s were a crazy time, an era where it's hard to imagine any politician going unscathed. To stay in the race, outsider Jimmy Carter would have to face unpopular geopolitical forces, kidnappings, economic turmoil, and much more, attempting to restore people's faith in their government, to lead a country struggling with alienation. You're listening to the show that uses journalistic tools to look inside the Christian church. We press pause on the culture wars in order to explore how we got here and how we can do better. I'm Chris Staron, and this is Truce. The country was looking for a strong leader, someone to tell them that everything was going to be okay, that they would always be wealthy. But Carter couldn't do that. My brother came up with this helpful word picture. Imagine an old farmhouse. A cellar, an attic. It's got lots of character, plenty of room, good elements. Charm, charm, charm. Look at that mold, the floors are original. A guy could really spread out in a place like this. There's just one problem. It's 200 years old. Jimmy Carter inherits this house with its beautiful views, but Also, it's history. And that history means it's going to need some work. You could leave it the way it is. But if you do, things are just going to get worse. Was Carter the man for the job, the contractor to get this thing in shape? Let's take a moment to look at his bio. Jimmy Carter was the first American president to be born in a hospital. Graduated from Annapolis in the top 10% of his class. He served in the Navy, including working on a submarine. He then took over the family farm in Georgia and taught Sunday school at Plains Baptist Church. Elected to the Board of Education, then the Georgia State Senate. Running for governor, his platform included... Wait a second. His platform included opposition to integrated busing. No, hold on, let me check my notes. Yeah, that's right. Carter opposed integrated busing when he ran for governor, leading the Atlanta Constitution to write that he was an
ignorant, racist, backward, ultra-conservative, red-necked South Georgia peanut farmer.
Sit with that for a moment, because our tendency is to divide history into heroes and scoundrels. But when you study history deeply enough, you find that the Bible's right. All have sinned and fallen short. We are complicated people with hiccups, biases, and flaws. Carter won the election for governor. Then, in 1976, he emerged as a dark horse in the race for president. So, this new aw shucks guy walks into the house, looks around, and notices there's a musty smell. Something bad must have happened with the previous tenant. In fact, it did. Gerald Ford, the Republican president, pardoned Richard Nixon.
Full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon.
The most inside baseball kind of act. Washington protecting its own. Leaving the nation, our house, with the foul smell of corruption. Soaked deep inside the carpet. So first thing, Carter, as the new tenant, has to rip up the carpeting. Get rid of the stench of corruption and cover-ups. He campaigned by telling audiences,
I want a government that is as good and honest and decent and truthful and fair and competent and idealistic and compassionate and as filled with love as are the American people.
This was an outsider candidate, campaigning as Jimmy, not James. Jimmy. The business-as-usual corrupt politicians were out. The carpet was ripped up and replaced. But the carpet was not the only issue. The lights in the house started to flicker. The heater just stopped working. The old house was in the middle of an energy crisis.
The third world kind of is saying that they want to control their own resources. That's kind of symbolized by the Arab oil embargo.
Oof, the Arab oil embargo? Oh, by the way, the voice you heard was Rick Perlstein, historian and author of Reaganland. Oil was a big problem in the 1970s. When Carter inherited the country, or the farmhouse, this was something that was already going on. The neighbors were feuding. In short, Egypt invaded Israel's house in 1973, back when Nixon occupied our farmhouse. He looked out his window, saw this fight going on across the street.
Hey, you get over here! Show me that!
And decided, they can't do that. I'm friends with Israel. I'm going to send them supplies. But of course, there was a problem. His old nemesis was also looking out his window and decided he was going to help Egypt.
It is us, the Soviet Union and our friend, Syria.
And now there's this nasty proxy war. The US and Israel on one side, Egypt, Syria, and the Soviet Union on the other. Americans' aid to Israel, no surprise, upset Arabs. Now, here's the thing. In this little community, our cul-de-sac, the Arabs run the power company. And if they don't like you, they can cut off power to your house. The petroleum-producing countries in the Middle East had this organization called Aramco. Imagine that they're typing up a letter. No, how many times do I have to tell you that infidels is not capitalized unless it's a proper noun? And they walk up the sidewalk and drop it in the mail slot. Nixon opens the letter.
What is it, dear?
The neighbors don't like that I helped Israel. They're pretty upset. Nixon didn't take it seriously. What's the worst that could happen? It's not like they're going to start holding back on oil sales to the US, right? I mean, they're not going to do that, right?
Richard Nixon had an energy expert who told him that, energy was going to be so cheap it didn't have to be metered, things like that. This idea that kind of we return to this almost Eden-like, ability to kind of be prosperous forever. It was a trauma.
For a lot of complicated reasons, the US's oil imports doubled in just 3 years. We're putting in a jacuzzi and driving a bigger car, so we need more power. The majority of that energy came from the Middle East. The Middle East, you guys, the Middle East. The people who sent that letter. They were not in love with the US, and certainly didn't like our friend Israel, who we helped in the neighborhood feud. So they put the squeeze on oil sales. OPEC, their cartel, controlled more than 80% of the world's exported oil. When Israeli troops entered Egypt, OPEC completely shut down exports to the United States, causing the price of gasoline at the pumps to increase by a factor of 5. Think about that. Another letter drops in the mail slot. This time, it's an energy bill.
What is it, dear?
Our costs of energy are skyrocketing. That was an understatement. Gas prices went up by a factor of 5. A factor of 5. This wasn't just a little economic stress. This was an emergency, leading to rationing and long lines at fuel stations. Again, that was during the Nixon years. Oh, just a reminder, I'm not a crook. I tell you all that because it's too simple to see what's happening to Carter as unique. There had been trouble with oil just a few years earlier during a Republican administration. Carter inherited that too when he took over the big farmhouse. Any good contractor will tell you that when you're renovating an old building, you'll fix one problem and then likely uncover another. Not only did Carter have to rip up the carpet, he had to deal with the neighbors, but when he did, he discovered yet another issue. The house was rapidly losing its value. The term for the economic feel of the Carter era was malaise. Not a great word. The house was in great shape in the 1950s, but in the 1970s, things were slowing down and the neighborhood fell on hard times.
For really the exhaustion of America's economic boom after World War II. This is a time in which real wages are skyrocketing, inequality is shrinking, it's a great compression. I like to say that people who were born with outhouses, in the 40s would have vacation houses by the 60s. A high school graduate or even a high school dropout, who had a strong back, was willing to kind of do drudgery, could get a decent union job and, support a family, right? And, that goes the way of all flesh by the middle of the 1970s for various reasons.
After World War II, much of the world was in shambles. In our house illustration, imagine a neighborhood that's falling apart, but one house is still up and running and in good shape. It gets all the attention. That was us, exporting, shipping, putting stuff on trains, taking stuff off of trains, a television in every living room. The US was making a killing as our goods had little to no competition. By the 1970s, that was no longer the case, as products from overseas entered the market.
Foreign competitors in places like Japan and Germany were outcompeting a very sclerotic American automobile industry that, in a lot of ways, really kind of resembled the old stereotypes of the old Soviet Union, right? And it's an inability to make kind of dynamic market-based decisions.
The American auto industry, that stalwart of our economy, couldn't keep up with VW's cool cars, or Japan's fuel-efficient models, which became critical in an era of expensive gas. Then there's the fact that well into the 80s and 90s, American cars declined in quality for a lot of reasons. Bloated unions, absenteeism in the factories, failure to update to fuel-efficient models, and the bullheaded belief that nobody could touch the US market share. America lost its strong grip on auto sales, something that continues to today. Liberals blame the malaise on conservatives for having tossed out the Great Society. Conservatives chalked it up to the failure of liberalism, regulation, and Keynesian economics. It's also likely that post-war boom just wasn't going to last as formerly bombed-out countries recovered, started to compete, and the wave of innovation slowed. The malaise continued. The big old farmhouse had problems. the lights were still flickering. In 1972, a barrel of oil cost $3.60. $3.60. In 1979, just 7 years later, during the Carter administration, it reached $25.10. This is where things get complicated. The house was in bad shape, worse than you could tell just by looking at it. Not only was the power source failing, but in our example, the whole electrical system needed fixing. The infrastructure that powered the whole place? Our money. So a person could either sit there and pretend that things were okay, hoping they'd get better on their own, or they could do something about it. But doing something was going to mean a full-scale renovation, and those are stressful. At the top of the show, I said that Americans like strong leaders. At least we say we do, as long as they keep telling us that everything is going to be all right. Carter couldn't do that. He put on his tool belt and got to work. The president went on television with a stern face to ask the American people to cut back in his famous crisis of confidence speech, where he called for alternative fuels, as well as,
and I'm asking you, for your good and for your nation's security, to take no unnecessary trips, to use carpools or public transportation whenever you can, to park your car 1 extra day per week, to obey the speed limit, and to set your thermostats to save fuel. Every act of energy conservation like this is more than just common sense. I tell you, it is an act of patriotism.
Americans, and I am one, we do not like to cut back or make sacrifices. We want promises of endless growth. But that is not what Carter went on television to do. He wasn't playing Santa Claus. He was more like the nation's dad telling us to close the door so we don't let the heat out. The nation was in the grips of a phenomenon known as stagflation. You probably know about this because we recently lived through it. But just in case, here is Jennifer Burns, author of Milton Friedman, The Last Conservative.
One relationship that people thought was pretty solid in the 50s and the 1960s was that if inflation went up, unemployment went down.
You may remember inflation from my episode about trickle-down economics. The Federal Reserve described it like this:
ongoing increases in the general price level for goods and services in an economy over time.
Essentially, when stuff costs more over time. As Jennifer said, the prevailing economic logic was that if inflation went up, if stuff costs more over time, then unemployment would go down.
Now, the inflation that took off across the developed world, starting in the United States, a lot of it was the pressure of spending on the Vietnam War, spending on social programs, and a loose monetary policy to enable that spending. And so then as inflation took off, unemployment also started to rise because it was a very uncertain economic climate. So suddenly this relationship that Friedman said is going to break down did break down.
Now the US had high unemployment and high inflation, which we call stagflation. Not unlike what happened at the end of the first Trump administration. How does something like that happen? An example Rick Perlstein gives in his book Reaganland goes something like this. Say you're a farmer.
Asparagus, pears, pumpkins, I grow them all.
If prices are going up and she wants to buy land sometime in the next few years, she's going to buy it now because it's cheaper now than it will be down the road.
I can finally own a cranberry farm.
Milton Friedman addressed this in his writings.
And this became very important to the modern study of inflation. He said one thing's really important about inflation is whether people expect it will happen or not. And he sort of argued once you get a little bit of inflation, people's behavior starts to change. Because they're trying to take advantage or they're trying to preserve their wealth in the face of inflation. So maybe they're asking for more of a wage increase or they're raising prices. And then all of a sudden, inflation can accelerate. It sort of has its own motor.
Back to our example. Our farmer gets a loan backed by the property she already owns because she thinks that inflation is going to make it more expensive down the road. Now she's got a bigger farm, which she can then turn around and mortgage to expand even more. Or build a barn. With that equity, she'll purchase shiny new equipment. If she wants to, she can get yet another loan based on that equipment. And on 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 and on.
I'm a regular tycoon.
Yeah, you know what? You are. If you know interest rates are going to go up in the next few months, you're going to make big purchases now instead of later. A Federal Reserve chief gave this example. If a person is driving and sees a yellow light, they might just speed up to get through it before it turns red. The same is true when people know that the Federal Reserve is going to raise interest rates. They press on the gas. Plus, and this is kind of important, this was an era when Americans could buy on credit. And we Americans kind of love to buy on credit. But our farmer is not the only person who works there. Because things cost more, her employees are gonna need a raise.
Uh-oh.
Which means she needs to increase her prices, helping to raise prices in the economy. Both the farmer and the employees are caught in this cycle. It's called cost-push inflation. They're all contributing to inflation. She increases the value of her property, which means she has to raise prices. With prices going up, her employees need a higher salary, which causes her to raise prices. And it goes around and around and around and around and around and around. The danger of this kind of inflation is that it keeps feeding itself. The cost of stuff goes up, so people buy now, which creates scarcity, which drives prices up. And so people buy now and on and on and on and on and on. Often when the US has periods of inflation, the Federal Reserve steps in and raises interest rates, making it harder to borrow money, thus slowing down those people who want to start cranberry farms or buy a new truck or whatever. They're trying to calm down the cycle. But in the 1970s, raising interest rates wasn't slowing inflation.
The action that Jimmy Carter takes in this kind of very strange story that involves his first appointee having some kind of weird conflict of interest and having to come up with a quick appointee on the fly, he appoints a guy named Paul Volcker to head the Federal Reserve.
This was in 1979, about a year before the election. A new Fed chair took office.
He was a Democrat. He was not seen as a particularly right-wing figure, but he had become very enamored of the theories of Milton Friedman.
Milton Friedman, darling of conservatives and the religious right. Now, all these episodes on economics are going to start paying off. One of Friedman's big ideas was monetarism. I won't get too deep into it. If you want to learn more about that, you can go to my episodes on Milton Friedman. But he said that
the government should ensure a stable monetary framework and stable monetary policy.
That sounds confusing, but it's actually pretty simple. Instead of raising and lowering interest rates, set them and forget them. Make it easy for customers and business owners to see the future.
In Friedman's day, there was a lot of talk about using rules versus discretion. So his idea was that the Federal Reserve should say, let's grow the money supply at 4% a year.
We'll set the interest rate in one place and lock it down so people know what to expect. And we can avoid all these surges and lags.
No matter what's happening, we're going to aim for 4% a year. And the sort of previous thinking would have been, oh, well, if things are slow, maybe we should push up to 6% a year. And then maybe if we're getting inflation, let's try to go down to 3% a year. And he said the problem with that, this is another famous Friedman saying, is monetary policy acts with a long and variable lag.
You can tamper with interest rates today, but the long-term effects won't be felt until months or even years later. Paul Volcker, Carter's head of the Federal Reserve, liked this idea. So did future Fed Chair Alan Greenspan, who was an acolyte of Ayn Rand, saying,
if adhered to, it would be the most important change in monetary policy in a generation.
Volcker knew that to follow this plan meant stalling the economy. In our traffic light example, instead of driving up to the light and the light goes from green to yellow to red, allowing people to speed up to beat the light, Volcker wanted to go from green to red, making the economy essentially jam on the brakes. Something that he knew would cause an economic downturn, even a recession, but hopefully would also stabilize inflation. Friedman predicted it would take 5 years to get back to stasis. It took only 4, but by then, the country lost 2.4 million manufacturing jobs.
In a way that really kind of enforced an austerity on the American people. In a lot of ways, it was an intentional forcing of a recession.
Not only was gas expensive, but thanks to Friedman and Volcker, in order to deal with inflation, the economy stalled on purpose.
So, Jimmy Carter could have distanced himself from this.
Because the Federal Reserve is, ideally, politically independent of Congress and the executive branch.
But Jimmy Carter had this kind of bone-deep idea that kind of what Americans were lacking was backbone and discipline, right? This is the Jimmy Carter of the oil crisis, who says we all need to wear sweaters and turn our thermostats down to 65 degrees, right? The secretaries in the White House were, typing with mittens on because it was, so frigid in the White House, right? And so he basically endorsed this. And this idea of wringing inflation out of the American economy caused basically 10% unemployment by the time he's running for re-election.
Back to the house analogy. Major renovations needed to be done. You can get by without them, maybe make it a few more years, but someday there's going to be a disaster. So he supported the Volcker shock, even though its very purpose was to stall the economy. And it did. This is a long way around to tell you that one of the reasons Jimmy Carter lost to Ronald Reagan is that by the election, the economy was in a slump. And another recession was coming a few months later. Recessions that Carter's team felt were necessary to curb inflation. But that meant sacrifice. This is really important to understanding this season. Why some evangelicals turned to the Republican Party. Even though Carter's Fed chair was a follower of their favorite economist, Milton Friedman, and even though Carter tried to cut taxes, he did away with government programs like dam projects and went so far as to turn the heat down in the White House to demonstrate government austerity and made $20 billion in cuts to his budget in March of 1980 and called for us to cut our dependence on foreign oil, conservatives still described his otherwise liberal administration as wasteful. Evidence that big L liberalism, the liberal consensus, was a failure.
And, the real benefits, such as they were, of lower inflation, it was Ronald Reagan who got credit for those when he reappointed Volcker. And, Jimmy Carter in 1980 trying to run for president is holding the bag.
That's not to say that Carter didn't sometimes fume that the Fed wasn't doing enough to urge the economy forward. He did. But he'd set his mind on the necessary renovations. And he got to work. Leading us to what may be the most important statistic of the entire season. Are you ready for it? Between 1964 and 1984, in just 20 years, inflation went up so much that the American dollar lost 70% of its value. A dollar spent in Reagan's presidency was worth just a fraction of what it was worth when Lyndon Johnson was in office. The inflation was so bad. Whereas the previous generation had been able to afford vacation homes and fancy cars, people in the late 70s felt the crunch right where they lived. When they bought groceries, when they filled their gas tanks, and when they voted. There's a reason we spent so much time talking about economics this season. For all the social changes that pushed evangelicals to the GOP, many Americans were becoming fiscally conservative as the economy restricted. Inflation limited their buying power, and one candidate told them to carpool and wear sweaters, as another promised them prosperity and greatness. I'll return with more after these messages. While you listen to the ads, why not take a moment to share the show with your friends on social media or via text? It really helps people find the show. Also, have you subscribed yet? Hit the subscribe button in your podcasting app so you get every new episode as it's released. Okay. Here come the ads. Welcome back to the Truce Podcast. Today, the many plagues of Jimmy Carter. Carter sometimes found himself choosing between the right thing to do and the thing that would make him look strong. He encouraged Americans to turn down their thermostats. In an era of big muscle cars, he told us to take fewer trips and to invest in alternative energy sources. He cut federal spending in the lead up to 1980.
So this is not the normal behavior of someone who's going into an election campaign. In fact, Richard Nixon very much did the opposite in 1971. He would do things like every discretionary piece of spending that the government could do, he did in order to create an artificial economic boom for 1972. So, you kind of contrast the cynicism of a Richard Nixon to kind of like the hair shirt kind of piety of a Jimmy Carter. And what you get is an economic situation by the time Ronald Reagan is, running for election in 1980 and basically promising tax cuts to everyone as a miracle of the loaves and fishes.
Carter wasn't playing the same game as Nixon and certainly wasn't playing the same game as Reagan. Not financially, and not on international issues. Let's pivot away from economics and look at our global standing. In our 200-year-old house analogy, the president would look out the window and see the neighbors feuding.
Come over here, you. Oh, I'm coming over there.
And some of the tension had been caused by previous tenants of our house. What the president needed was to restore the neighborhood's trust in each other and in the United States. I mean, our house. Something Carter addressed with the Panama Canal.
When Jimmy Carter died, it wasn't really part of the obituaries, even though it was one of his most profound diplomatic accomplishments, and also something that was very symbolic of the post-60s movement in American politics. We're coming out of Vietnam, and the idea of America as this kind of 600-pound imperial gorilla was quite widespread. I just saw a poll, 72% of Americans in 1978 not only said they opposed the Vietnam War, but they affirmatively said that it had been immoral. So there's this real re-examination of America's role in the world. And in a lot of ways, the Panama Canal Treaty was that movement's institutional embodiment.
The United States took over for this French imperialist project during the Teddy Roosevelt administration, digging a canal that would, essentially, serve as an American territory in Central America. The plan, going back years before Carter, was to undo this act of imperialism and give the canal to the people of Panama.
The movement when that really kind of started to shift was in 1964 when there were riots in the Panama Canal Zone, over the flying of the American or the Panamanian flag. And Lyndon Johnson realized that this was not necessarily healthy for America's strategic position in the long term, largely because the biggest military ships couldn't even go through the Panama Canal anymore. The biggest super tankers didn't go through the Panama Canal anymore. So it really wasn't even something that was even really kind of an asset for America.
The plan to give the canal over by the year 2000 started in the Nixon and Ford administrations. But progress was slow. Reagan, during his primary campaign against Ford in 1976, made this a centerpiece of his platform with the pithy slogan, "We built it, we paid for it, it's ours." A bold, macho statement.
One of the reasons this took off first in 1976 and then as one of the most galvanizing organizing issues of the New Right during the Carter administration was because it was a way to talk about keeping America great again. The idea that America was giving up part of its territory in a way that Ronald Reagan said it was like we're giving up Texas. This idea that sort of America was somehow being emasculated.
As you'll remember from the first episode of the season, the deal went through and the canal was gradually handed over to the people of Panama. Something that at the time of this recording, President Trump is hoping to undo. And the New Right spent a lot of money fighting this process.
The right is just sending out kind of millions of direct mail pieces, putting together propaganda films, speeches at places like VFW halls and American Legion halls, and really with some extraordinarily nasty and often anti-Semitic rhetoric. Phyllis Schlafly especially was quite anti-Semitic. If you kind of check out her debate with it on Firing Line with William F. Buckley, William F. Buckley realized that, the Panama Canal really was kind of useless to America. It could be given up to America's advantage. And he did a famous debate with Ronald Reagan on Firing Line. And he did another less famous debate with Phyllis Schlafly. And Phyllis Schlafly just kind of talked about how this was the Rockefellers and the international bankers, who Jimmy Carter was serving.
The issue was used to attack senators, questioning their religious faith based on their opinion of the Panama Canal. even though the fate of a waterway in Central America is wholly overlooked in Scripture. As Rick said, this was an achievement of the Carter administration, to take steps to repent for America's imperialist past, which had us doing things like claiming Puerto Rico and not giving it full recognition as part of the United States, while also not allowing it to be self-governed, or overthrowing governments in places like Guatemala. Strong, bold moves, yes, but moves that left a distaste for the United States around the world. And moves that would be tried again during the Reagan administration in Nicaragua. We'll get there. The Panama Canal Treaty was a bipartisan plan, and arguably an astute foreign policy move. But going back to the idea from the top of the show, is it something a strong leader would do? Is turning American territory over to a foreign nation something that American people wanted more of? If we are people opposed to sacrifice, would we be willing to give up a waterway just to right a decades-old wrong? There were other big issues that played a role in Carter losing the 1980 election. The tax revolt that started in California and spread across the country. An infusion of mean-spirited mailings by the new right. Continued wariness over the Soviet Union and the Cold War. His brother Billy, who seemed to always be in the news. There's one more event in Carter's administration that we need to touch on before we go. According to a former CIA director, Iran was on its way to becoming a world power. But the people were rising up against the Shah, a tyrant who was supported by the US. In January of 1979, there was a revolution, and American hostages were taken. We made a big push to try and retrieve them, and failed publicly. President Carter's approval ratings fell to 38%. The hostage crisis continued for over a year, with the Reagan campaign concerned that there would be an October surprise, that the Carter administration would orchestrate the release to happen right before the election. The hostages were held for several more months, not released until Inauguration Day of 1981, thus giving the glory, in part, to Ronald Reagan, though he didn't take credit for it. Conventional wisdom said that Carter lost because he couldn't free the hostages in time for the election. That is not backed by the numbers, but the rumor persists. Statistically, Carter won the issue, but he didn't win the election. 1980 was a momentous moment. Americans were exhausted from all the protests, rising crime, hijacking, the oil crisis, the hostage situation, dark news stories, communist shenanigans, and much more. What they were looking for was not a leader who told them to stay home more often, carpool, and do what was right for the country. As Pat Goodell's research showed, Americans primarily felt alienated, left out, overlooked. That's why they voted for Carter in the first place. Because he was a man outside of Washington with an aw-shucks modesty who tried to be all things to all people. Something that would whip the old house into shape. But it turns out that what they really wanted was someone who could at least appear to be tough. Who would tell them that everything was going to be all right. They didn't need to cut back, they needed to spend more. To deregulate, give tax breaks to the wealthy, and ignore the skyrocketing national debt. In this episode, we've covered the secular reasons Carter lost the election. In the next, we'll look specifically at why Carter lost the evangelical vote. But, and I hope to say this a couple of times during the season, Reagan won by such a large margin that the evangelical vote didn't matter. Not only did it not matter, a greater percent of evangelicals voted for Nixon than did for Reagan. As valuable as the study of evangelical support for Reagan is, we didn't get him elected. He would likely have done it anyway. The stuff in this episode is why he won. Because Americans don't like austerity, or our people being taken hostage, even though that happened a bunch under Reagan too. Or a leader who tells us to eat our vegetables. No leader is perfect. And Carter certainly was not perfect. The people wanted something different. Not the guy who put on his tool belt and did the work to purge the house of its problems, but the man who promised them that the issues were not really what weakened the house. They wanted to believe the problem was government, taxes, and naysayers. Special thanks to all my guests for this episode, including Rick Perlstein. He talked to me for a total of 3 hours over the course of this season. Truly, his books are great. He's got a series of 4 that charts the Republican Party from Goldwater to Reagan. This episode, I mostly used The Invisible Bridge and Reaganland, and both are wonderful. I'm also indebted to Jennifer Burns. Her book is Milton Friedman, The Last Conservative. As I wrote this episode, I had so many books open, including These Truths by Jill Lepore, Reagan by Bob Spitz, God's Own Party by Daniel K. Williams, and Jimmy Carter's Presidential Diary. The audio for Carter's speech is from C-SPAN. And I didn't include the audio here, but I watched a fair bit of Phyllis Schlafly's debate on firing line. A full list of sources, as per usual, is in your show notes and on the website. My brother Nick came up with a house metaphor for this episode and is always generous with his ideas. Thanks, Nick. You're a great encouragement. I'm also indebted to my friends who gave me their voices for this episode, including Bob Stevenson, Josh Griffith, Chris Sloan, Jackie Hart, Dave Monroe, and Marcus Watson of the Spiritual Life and Leadership podcast. If you want to help me make this project, please consider subscribing to the show instead of just listening a la carte. It helps my numbers be more consistent. Also, email your favorite podcasts and ask them to have me on as a guest. For a while now, Truce has been my full-time job, which is thanks to listeners like you who give $10 a month or more. Visit trucepodcast.com/donate to help me out, or Venmo me at @trucepodcast. If you want to buy me some extra apples this month, or dried mango, or pay my electricity bill, visit trucepodcast.com/donate. Truce is a production of Truce Media, LLC. God willing, we'll talk again soon. I'm Chris Staron, and this is Truce.